My name is Marisol Delgado. I am 34 years old, and I have kept a file on every job I ever did inside my family's business. Not because I plan to use it, because I am the kind of person who keeps records, who writes down what she did and when and for whom, and moves on to the next thing that needs doing. I kept that file for 10 years before I understood what it was actually for. For most of those years, I believed that if you worked hard enough inside a family, the family would eventually see you. I was wrong. Not in the small, correctable way, where you adjust your expectations and move on. I mean wrong in the way that takes years to understand, because the evidence was always right in front of me and I kept finding reasons to explain it away. I kept thinking, they're busy, they're stressed, they'll come around. My father was the kind of man who filled every room he entered, not with warmth, but with the particular gravity of someone who has decided, long ago, that his version of events is the only one worth keeping. He built Delgado Event Holdings from a single banquet hall in the outskirts of San Antonio into 3 properties across South Texas over the course of 22 years. He talked about it the way other men talk about their children, with a pride that had edges on it that implied the rest of us should feel grateful just to stand near it. My sister Gabriella, 3 years younger and possessed of a talent for being precisely where the praise was, attended the events as a guest, drifting through in whatever she was wearing that week, charming the clients my father most wanted charmed. I worked them. Set up crews at 15. Vendor coordination at 19. The difference between us was never spoken about, only arranged the way furniture gets arranged, quietly in the night, and you're just expected to understand the new layout in the morning. If you're watching this and you've ever been the one in your family who just kept showing up and doing the work while someone else got to be the one everyone fussed over, I want you to stay with me. Because what happened at my sister's wedding is something I think you will understand down to your bones. I had a degree in hospitality management from UT San Antonio, which I finished while working 20 hours a week at the second property my father opened, the one on the north side that needed the most attention. I graduated on a Saturday. We had a quinceañera booked that evening that I had spent 3 weeks coordinating, and my father needed me there for the setup. I went. My mother saved me a piece of graduation cake from the small celebration they had without me, wrapped in a paper towel on the kitchen counter. She said my father was proud of me. I believed her because I wanted to. The business, by the time I was 28, was running in large part because of systems I had built. Not because I was given credit for them, I wasn't, not in any formal way, but because I was the one in the building when the decisions needed to be made. My father traveled. He attended industry conferences in Dallas and Houston and came back with new ideas he would present to me as directives, and I would implement them, and 6 months later he would present the results to his colleagues as proof of his own vision. I smiled and let it happen because the alternative, arguing with a man who had never once in my memory said he was wrong about anything, seemed like a way to lose everything at once. My name was not on the business. It was never discussed as something that might be. The business was Delgado Event Holdings and my father was Ernesto Delgado, and those two things were, in his mind, the same noun. I was Marisol. I helped. That was the arrangement. The first time my sister Gabriella did something that I could not explain away as accident or carelessness, I was 26. Our cousin Pilar was getting married. A smaller affair, about 80 guests, held at our oldest property, the original hall on Callahan Road. I had spent the better part of 6 weeks coordinating the details with Pilar directly because she trusted me, because we had grown up together and she knew what I was capable of. The florals, the caterer, the timeline, the seating, the sound equipment, all of it ran through me. My father showed up an hour before the ceremony in a dark suit and greeted the arriving guests like he had built the afternoon by hand. The reception ran beautifully. Afterward, Pilar hugged me at the door and said, quietly, that it was the best event she had ever been to and that she knew who made it happen. That meant more to me than I knew how to say out loud, so I just squeezed her hands and told her I was glad. The next morning at Sunday breakfast, my mother made chilaquiles and my father sat at the head of the table with his coffee and said that the Reyes wedding had gone well. Gabriella, who had attended in a red dress and spent most of the evening talking to Pilar's husband's younger brothers, looked up from her phone and said, brightly, that the flowers were gorgeous. My father said, Gabriella, you have an eye for these things. You should be more involved. I set down my fork. I picked it back up. I ate the rest of my breakfast without saying anything, because there was nothing I could have said in that room that would have landed the way I needed it to. Gabriella looked at me across the table with an expression I had seen before and could never quite name. Not cruelty exactly, more like a casual awareness of something that amused her. She said, "Maybe I will." She did not become more involved. What she became was more present at the moments when credit was being distributed, which is a different thing entirely. The pattern established itself with the quiet efficiency of something that doesn't need to announce itself to work. At family dinners, when the business came up, and it always came up because my father had no other primary subject, the conversation organized itself around his vision and Gabriella's enthusiasm for it, and my contributions were received the way the furniture is received, acknowledged only when something went wrong with them. My mother listened and passed dishes and occasionally said my name in a way that was meant to include me but only made the exclusion more visible. At my father's 60th birthday party, which I planned and booked and coordinated the catering for, and which was held at the Northside property, my Uncle Hector gave a toast. He talked about my father's legacy, his hard work, his vision. He talked about Gabriella, who stood next to my father with her hand on his arm, and her face arranged into the expression she wore when she wanted to look like she belonged to something important. He did not mention me. My father did not correct the omission. I walked to the edge of the patio that night and looked out at the parking lot for a while. My chest felt strange. Not tight exactly, more like something had shifted slightly out of alignment and was pressing against the wrong wall. I went back inside when the cake came out. I cut the first slice myself because I was the one who knew where the serving utensils were, and that was, as usual, the extent of it. Gabriella caught me in the kitchen that night and said, with the kind of sweetness that has a point on it, "Daddy really outdid himself with this party." She said it looking directly at me. I squared the plastic wrap over the leftover cake before I answered her. "He really did," I said. She smiled and walked back out to the patio. Here is what the years between 22 and 32 looked like, in actual terms. I spent 10 years inside Delgado Event Holdings in every functional capacity the business required. Not as a figurehead, not as an assistant. As the person who kept the machinery running while my father managed the face of the enterprise and my sister managed the proximity to that face. I negotiated the linen contract with Aguirre Textile in the spring of my 23rd year, after the previous vendor raised prices without notice mid-season and left us scrambling for 3 bookings in a row. I found the replacement, ran the numbers, presented them to my father, and got a nod. We saved $11,000 that year on linens alone. That contract was still in place a decade later. I hired and trained the floor coordinator at the Callahan property when the previous one left without notice in July of my 25th year, 6 weeks before our peak fall season. I interviewed 12 candidates, selected one, ran a 2-week overlap training with her, and ensured the property didn't lose a single booking during the transition. Her name was Lucinda, and she was still working there when the events of this story took place. I built the vendor rotation system that my father later presented to a hospitality roundtable in Houston as an operational innovation, a tiered backup structure so that no single vendor failure could collapse a booked weekend. I wrote the original document on a Tuesday night at the kitchen table in my apartment with a cup of coffee that went cold beside me while I worked. My father's name was on the version he presented in Houston. I noted that in the file and moved on. I restructured the pricing model for the Northside property in my 27th year after 2 consecutive quarters of underperformance. I pulled 3 years of booking data, identified the compression problem in our midweek corporate packages, and repriced them in tiers. Revenue on that property increased by 31% in the following year. My father told his accountant it was a market correction. I added the quarter-over-quarter numbers to the file and said nothing. I managed the insurance claim and full kitchen renovation at the Callahan property after a grease fire caused $140,000 in damage on a Thursday night in March of my 29th year. I was on site by midnight. I coordinated the contractors, maintained communication with the booked clients, rescheduled 4 events without a single cancellation, and had the property operational again in 11 weeks. My father flew back from a conference in Dallas for the reopening and brought a bottle of wine he gave to the head contractor. I sourced the 3rd property, a venue in New Braunfels that my father had mentioned offhandedly as a fantasy. once at dinner, by spending 4 months identifying candidates, running comps, pulling zoning records, and presenting a formal acquisition analysis. He bought it. He named it himself. At the signing, he brought Gabriella. I did not attend the signing. I had a Saturday booking at the Northside property that I was covering because the floor coordinator called in sick and someone had to be there. I learned about the purchase being finalized from our family group chat. My mother sent a celebratory emoji. Gabriella sent a photo of herself and my father in front of the new Braunfels venue, both of them smiling, my father with his arm around her shoulders. I set my phone face down on the coordinator's desk and finished the walkthrough. These are the years I am talking about. Not a vague sense of being underappreciated, concrete actions, specific outcomes, documented time. 10 years of them. I kept records not because I planned to use them, but because I am the kind of person who keeps records. It's how I was trained, by the business itself, by the reality of running events where a single missing detail costs someone their wedding day. I documented everything because everything mattered. I just didn't know yet how much that documentation would matter to me. Gabriella announced her engagement to Marco Fuentes in November. Marco was the kind of man my father approved of immediately. From a family my father recognized, in a profession my father respected, with a manner that deferred to older men in the room in exactly the way my father preferred. The engagement dinner was held at the new Braunfels property, which had been operational for 18 months by then and which I had spent the better part of a year helping stabilize after the purchase. I sat at the far end of the table. My father toasted the couple. Gabriella cried in the beautiful, calibrated way she had always cried. Marco looked genuinely happy, and for that I held no grudge against him. He didn't know the full architecture of what he was marrying into. What happened next unfolded over the following 7 months, and I want to describe it precisely because the sequence matters. My father told me in January that he and Gabriella had decided to hold the wedding at the Callahan property. He told me this over the phone, in the same tone he used to relay operational decisions. He said he wanted me to coordinate the event. Not to plan it with Gabriella, to coordinate it. As a vendor, essentially. As staff. I said I understood. My mother called me the next day and said she hoped I wasn't upset. I told her I wasn't. I was hurt, honestly. Not in a way I could explain in 30 seconds to someone who still believed the family was basically fair, but the distinction between what I felt and what I said in this family had been refined over so many years that it no longer cost me anything to maintain it. I coordinated the wedding. I built the timeline, confirmed the vendors, managed the floor plan, handled the catering communication, coordinated the florals with the company Gabriella selected, a boutique out of Austin that charged 3 times what our usual vendor charged and delivered results that were, objectively, beautiful. I did not attend the planning meetings with Gabriella. I received her decisions through my father, relayed through a group text that included my mother and Marco's mother, and I executed them. 6 weeks before the wedding, I received the seating chart from my mother. She had forwarded it from Gabriella's email without comment. I opened it on my laptop on a Wednesday morning, sitting at my desk in my apartment. My name was on the chart. I looked at it for a long time. I was not seated in the main reception hall. I was not seated at a family table or a cousin's table or even a vendor's table inside the hall itself. My name was assigned to a small table in the corridor outside the main entrance, the hallway that connected the reception hall to the parking level foyer. A transitional space. It had a window that looked out onto the side parking lot. I had booked that hall for 62 events over the course of my career. I knew the hallway my sister had seated me in. On event days, we used it to stage extra chairs. I sat with that seating chart open on my screen for a while. My throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with crying. It was the specific constriction of something that confirms what you already knew but hoped, stupidly, was not true. I closed the laptop. I got up and made coffee. I stood at my kitchen window while it brewed and watched a bird on the power line outside, and I thought about what I was actually going to do. I called no one. I sent no text. I did not forward the seating chart back with a note. I simply noted the placement, closed the file, and returned to the work I had been doing. The work of making my sister's wedding as flawless as everything else I had ever built for this family. But I made one phone call that afternoon that had nothing to do with the wedding. It was to a woman named Patricia Salinas at a law office in San Antonio that I had identified 8 months earlier and quietly retained. I told her we were ready to move to the next stage. She said she would have the documents prepared within the week. I had an envelope by the following Thursday. I put it in the inside pocket of the bag I would carry to the wedding. And then I went back to work and I waited. The wedding was on a Saturday in late June, and the Callahan property looked the way it always looked when everything was done correctly, which is to say it looked effortless, which is the specific illusion that 10 years of practiced coordination produces. The florals from the Austin boutique were set by 8 in the morning. The caterers were staged and confirmed by 9. The sound check was completed at 10:15, 7 minutes ahead of schedule, because I had built 7 minutes of buffer into the timeline, and the crew knew me well enough not to burn it. I wore a dress the color of a dark plum. I had bought it 3 months earlier, before the seating chart arrived, when I still imagined I might be seated somewhere that warranted it. I wore it anyway. The ceremony was held in the main hall, chairs arranged in the arc configuration Gabriella had requested, the aisle lit with the pillar candles I had sourced from the vendor in Seguin after the Austin boutique's quote came in 40% over budget. Nobody knew that. The candles looked beautiful. Gabriella walked down the aisle in a dress that had cost more than my first car, and she was radiant in it, and Marco looked at her the way someone looks when they cannot believe their luck, and I sat in the third row and thought, the catering is on time, the sound is clean, the flowers are right. Everything I built is holding. After the ceremony, the guests moved to the reception hall. I watched the flow from the side corridor, the same hallway where my name appeared on the seating chart, and confirmed the transition was clean. Then I found my table. It was a round 4-top pushed against the wall beside the window. There were 2 other place cards on it. A great-aunt of Marco's who lived in Laredo and had arrived with a walker, and a cousin of Gabriella's from her father's side. My father's side, who was 8 years old and had spent most of the ceremony taking photographs of his own shoes. The hallway smelled like the floor polish we used on event mornings and faintly, from the kitchen prep area 30 feet down, like the appetizers being plated for the main hall. I sat down. I set my bag on the chair beside me. Inside it, in the front interior pocket, was the envelope from Patricia Salinas. Gabriella appeared at the entrance to the hallway approximately 4 minutes into the reception. She was moving between rooms, doing the rounds with Marco at her elbow, and she paused when she reached the hallway entrance and looked at me with the expression I had come to understand over the course of my life as her version of victory. Not loud, not theatrical, but present and deliberate, calibrated to land without witnesses. She said, "There you are. I wanted to make sure you found your seat all right." I looked at her steadily. "I found it." She said, "I know it's a little tucked away, but we had so many people to fit in, and you know how it is. You of all people understand the space limitations." She smiled. "Guess you don't count as a guest when you basically work here." I set my bag strap flat across my lap with both hands before I answered her. "I understand the space completely," I said. "You should get back to Marco." She held the smile for another beat, then drifted back into the main hall. I sat with the ambient noise of the reception filtering through the doorway. The clinking, the music, my father's voice carrying over other voices the way it always did, and I breathed evenly and thought about nothing in particular. The great-aunt from Laredo patted my hand and said the flowers were beautiful. I told her they were. The 8-year-old took a photograph of the table centerpiece. I waited 20 minutes. Then I picked up my bag, stood, and walked into the main hall. My father was at the head table beside my mother, Marco's parents to his right, a cluster of men he considered peers arranged at the nearest round table. I walked toward him directly. Because I had learned a long time ago that hesitation in a room like this reads as uncertainty, and I was not uncertain. I was the most certain I had been in years. He saw me coming, and his expression shifted into the version of attentive that he used when he wanted to look generous. "Marisol," he said. "Good, the food service is." "I'm not here about the food service," I said. I pulled the chair beside him, the one that had been empty since my mother moved to speak with Marco's mother, and I sat down. I reached into my bag and produced the envelope. I placed it on the table in front of him, then reached back in and set a second, thinner document beside it. He looked at both without touching them. What is this? The first one, I said, is a formal notice from Patricia Salinas at Salinas and Reyes Legal Group in San Antonio. It concerns Delgado Event Holdings, specifically the ownership structure, the operational contribution record, and a legal claim I filed 8 weeks ago regarding undocumented sweat equity and misappropriated intellectual property developed under my direct authorship over a 10-year period. The noise of the reception continued around us. Someone laughed at a nearby table. The music shifted. My father's face went very still in a way I recognized. It was the stillness that preceded his voice dropping rather than rising, which was always more alarming than the volume. You filed a claim, he said. At your sister's wedding. I filed the claim 8 weeks ago, I said. I'm notifying you today because today is the day you seated me in the hallway next to the parking lot, and I decided that was a reasonable place to draw the line. I tapped the second document. That one is a copy of the operational contribution record I've maintained since I was 22. Every contract I negotiated. Every vendor I sourced. Every revenue improvement I implemented and its documented outcome. 10 years of it. Patricia has the original. He reached for the second document. He opened it. He scanned the first page, then the second, and I watched the stillness in his face change into something harder to read. Not anger yet, something underneath anger, the expression of a man encountering a version of events he cannot immediately reframe. This is not the place, he said. You chose the place, I said. Not me. My mother had returned to her seat. She was looking between us with her hands folded in her lap and her face very careful. At the edge of my vision I saw Gabriella, who had caught the quality of silence at the head table from across the room and was moving toward us with Marco a step behind. My father set the document down. He looked at me with the full weight of a man who has used his authority the way some people use furniture, to take up space, to define the shape of the room, and I looked back at him and felt nothing close in me to flinching. Marisol, he said, and his voice had dropped to the register I had feared for 30 years. You will not do this here. I've already done it, I said. Patricia will be in contact Monday morning. Everything in that envelope has been filed. I picked up my bag. I stood. The caterers know the service timeline. Lucinda is on the floor. The evening will run exactly the way I built it to run. I walked out of the main hall through the side corridor, past my table, past the window that looked onto the parking lot, and through the exterior door into the late June evening. I heard Gabriella's voice behind me, high and sudden, saying my father's name. I did not turn around. I walked to my car, put the bag on the passenger seat, and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. Then I drove home. I learned what happened next from 3 sources over the following week. My mother, who called me on Sunday morning, Lucinda, who texted me that night, and my cousin Pilar, who had been seated 2 tables from the head table and had watched the whole thing unfold. My mother called first. She said, Marisol, your father is very upset. I told her I understood that. She said, why didn't you tell me? And I said, because it wasn't ready, Mama, and because I needed to know I could do it alone first. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said my name in the voice she used when she didn't know what to do with something, and I told her I loved her and that I would call her in a few days. Lucinda told me that Gabriella had gone pale when she reached the head table and understood what the documents were. That was the word she used, pale. She said Marco had guided Gabriella to a seat and asked my father quietly what was happening, and my father had said it was a family matter, which was the truest thing he had said in years. Pilar called me on Tuesday, which was when I finally felt ready to talk to someone who would ask real questions. She said she had seen me stand and leave and had spent the rest of the reception trying to figure out what to do. I told her the whole of it, not just the wedding but the decade before it. The linen contract. The vendor system. The Northside pricing restructure. The new Braunfels acquisition I had sourced and never attended the signing of. The fire at Callahan Road and the 11 weeks I spent getting it back online while my father accepted a bottle of wine from the contractor. All of it in sequence. Pilar listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always loved about her. When I was finished, she said, How long have you been keeping records? I said, since I was 22. She said, good. The confrontation with my father, when it came, did not happen at the wedding. It happened the following Thursday, in his office at the Callahan property, the same office where I had sat across from him dozens of times over the years to present operational updates and receive decisions I hadn't been consulted on. Patricia was on the phone. My father had his own attorney present, a man named Vega who had handled his business filings for 15 years and who spent the first 10 minutes of the meeting reviewing the contribution record with the expression of someone doing arithmetic they do not like the answer to. At some point during that meeting, my father looked at me and said the thing I had heard in various forms my entire career inside that business. He said, "You never asked for more responsibility." I folded my hands on the table before I answered him. "You told me," I said, when I was 23, that the linen contract was handled and that I should focus on floor coordination. I had already negotiated a new contract that saved $11,000 that year. You presented it to the vendor as your own decision. He started to say something. "You told me," I continued, when I was 27, that the Northside Properties numbers were a market correction. I had the pricing analysis on your desk 6 weeks before the quarter closed. I wrote it on a Tuesday night. I have the original file, time-stamped. Marisol. You told me at your 60th birthday that the evening had come together beautifully. I planned it. I booked it. I coordinated every vendor in that room. You gave the contractor a bottle of wine. I paused. And you told me, through a forwarded email on a Wednesday morning 6 weeks ago, that my seat at my sister's wedding was a table in the staging hallway next to the parking lot. I let that sit in the air between us for a moment. While you were doing all of that, I was building a record. Every contract. Every revenue number. Every time-stamped document that originated from my desk before it became your announcement. 10 years of it. Patricia has all of it. Mr. Vega has now seen it. I looked at my father. He looked older than I had seen him look in years, which was not a thing I felt triumphant about. It was just true. "I'm not asking you to say you're sorry," I said. "I'm asking for what the record shows I built." I stood. I picked up my portfolio and walked out of the office without shutting the door hard behind me. In the hallway outside, I passed Lucinda going the other direction with a clipboard, and she looked at me and gave me a small nod that contained everything that needed to be said between us. The settlement took 4 months. I will not give you every number, but I will tell you that Patricia Salinas is very good at her job, and that a decade of documented contribution, when presented cleanly and completely, is a difficult thing to argue against, even for a man who has spent 30 years deciding what version of events the room accepts. I am no longer a coordinator at Delgado Event Holdings. My name is now on the ownership documents for the Callahan Road property, which is the one I know best, the one I have loved longest, the one where I learned what industrial carpet cleaner smells like early on a Saturday morning before anyone else arrives, when the hall is still empty and quiet and entirely full of what's about to happen. My father and I do not speak often. When we do, it is careful and brief, which is an improvement over what came before, when it was warm and dishonest. My mother comes to dinner at my apartment twice a month. She brings the good salsa, the kind she makes herself, and she sits at my kitchen table and talks about things that have nothing to do with the business, and I think that is her way of saying she is sorry without quite having the language for it yet. I accept it because I love her, and because I understand that some people are so deep inside a story that they can only begin to see it from the outside gradually, over time. Gabriella and I have not spoken since the wedding. I do not know if we will. I have stopped trying to predict what reconciliation looks like in a family where the injuries were structural rather than accidental. What I know is this: there is a difference between being loyal to your family and being invisible inside it. I confused those two things for a very long time, and the confusion cost me a decade. Not in bitterness. I do not carry this as bitterness, but in the simple accounting of time and what it was used for and who received the credit for it. What you build in silence eventually speaks. You just have to give it the right room. If this story reached something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are more people sitting at the hallway table than anyone talks about, and sometimes the most useful thing is knowing that someone else found their way to a different seat. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Names, characters, events, and details are entirely fictional and do not represent real individuals or actual events.